Welcome everyone to the latest in a series of development and support webinars delivered by the NIHR Academy. My name is Lucy and I work at the NIHR Academy as the Senior Development and Support Manager. This webinar, Presenting and Public Speaking, is delivered in conjunction between the NIHR Academy and Capfinity, our leadership programme partners, and will be facilitated by Simon Rollins. Simon is a hugely experienced trainer and speaker. He's passionate about helping people communicate in an influential way and be the most confident, authentic and engaging communicators they can be. Simon, I'll now hand over to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Lucy, and a very big welcome to everybody. So what we are looking at today is thinking about how we can be confident, authentic and engaging. And I'll do a bit of an intro in a moment, but we're just going to get straight in to thinking about a question. Now, for those that are watching the YouTube version of this, you won't see a poll. For those that are currently on this session with us live, I'm going to launch the poll now. So how much do you currently enjoy public speaking stroke presenting? With 0 being, I really want to run a mile if I could, or just roll up into a ball and rock back and forth, and 10 being, I can't get enough of it, Simon. I love it. So I love the fact that there is already over 50% of people that have chosen. So for those that are watching this not live, just think about that question yourself. What would your answer be to that? So I'll give it about 20 more seconds. We're already up to 86%. There's 0% on the love at the moment, which is perhaps not that shocking. Okay, thereabouts. I'll give you 15 more seconds for those still pondering. Who doesn't like a good ponder? Okay, right. I'm going to end the poll there, and we can all, well, I say we can all see the results. For those that are live, we can see the results. So for those that are rewatching this, there was 19% gave it a 0. So that's a pretty strong indictment of perhaps why you're here today. So you're in safe hands. And then, yeah, we've got 10% for 1, 11% for 2. There's quite a lot of 1, 2, 3s and 4s. But delightfully, there isn't a single 10, which is perhaps understandable, but there's a few of you that went 9, which is great. And there's a decent amount of 6s and 7s as well. So fantastic. And what we are here today to do is not make everyone a 10. But for those of you that are kind of maybe 6 and above, it's to consolidate all the great stuff you're currently doing. And hopefully, from my point of view, give you 1 or 2 tips and tricks that I've learned along the way to really elevate your presentations. And for those that are 5 or below, it's certainly to help you perhaps move up a few notches and at least see the light and think there is a way forward. And honestly, I said I'd sort of kind of do an introduction, and I could have talked about the fact that I've been doing this for 20 years and I've spoken to thousands of people across the world, from as far from Brazil to Hong Kong, in person, all sorts of great big events with 1,000 people or more. But actually that wasn't the start of my journey with presenting. The start was a school competition. And my teacher, Mrs. Cleve, my English teacher, who I got on really well with, she put me forward for this competition called Youth Speaks. I have no idea if it still exists, but it was this national competition, and it was 3-person teams. She put me forward as the main speaker, and then I had a friend who was introducing me in the session, or the 5-minute speech, and then another friend who was doing like the conclusion. And so my very first ever presentation or public speaking was to about 200 people in a little like church hall in my hometown. And there was all the other schools that had been entered. And I was about 6th up, I think, my team. And Sarah did a wonderful job of basically it was just a roast for 2 minutes of me. So that wasn't great, but she did a great job. And then I was feeling pretty good. I'd prepared, I'd rehearsed loads. And then as I got up, I realized I've got a bit of a problem here, because thankfully there was a lectern and it had one of those little mics that kind of comes round. So people couldn't see my legs, because that was where the problem was. Because at that particular moment, I was a full 0. If I could have run out of there without kind of completely losing face, I would have done. Because my right leg was shaking so uncontrollably badly that my school uniform that I had on, it was making my school shirt slap against my stomach. And all I could think about was that the mic is going to be picking that up. And I didn't know what to do. So I just started the speech. But for the entire 5 minutes, the slap against my stomach was happening because my right leg was shaking so badly. And I finished, and I was so relieved to have finished. I don't think I've ever been more relieved in my life. And I thought to myself, I'm never doing that again. And there was actually a break after our school, after our team's go. And I went round, and Mrs. Cleve, my teacher who put me forward, was there. And she was just kind of like slowly shaking her head, like smiling at me. And I was like, oh no, like this is going to be bad. And she said, Simon, she always spoke very gently. She said, Simon, I'll be really honest. I gave you this as a kind of light-hearted punishment because you always speak up in my class. And I just thought I'd give you something that kind of like not takes you down a peg or two, but essentially that's what she was going for. And I started laughing. I was like, oh, yeah, thanks for that. Well, it definitely worked. Like, that was awful. And then she started laughing and she said, like, what do you mean it was awful? You look so relaxed. And then when I explained the leg thing, she just couldn't get over it. She found it hilarious. And I honestly don't think if I hadn't had that feedback that she didn't realize I was literally terrified, I don't think I'd be doing what I do now for a living. And for the past 20 years, it's literally what I've done for a living. But it really has been a slow journey from, quite frankly, 0 through to a 10. And along that journey has been loads of professional presentations when I used to be a buyer and a negotiator and all that sort of stuff. But actually, that was really formative as well, because I learned the psychology of influencing. And when it comes to engagement, that is key. So really, that's what we're going to be talking about, is how we can have our own journey and get to the point where, and quite frankly, if nothing else, if literally you didn't remember a single thing other than what I'm about to say, is that unless you tell people you're nervous, they actually won't know. It's so rare, unless you're holding I haven't got a single sheet of paper. If you're holding a single sheet of paper, which this isn't, but that's a bit of a giveaway. So never hold a single sheet of paper or use a laser pointer, because again, that really exacerbates shaking. Other than that, keep it to yourself. We'll talk about that later. So what are we talking about then? So it's sharing ideas, whether that's change, whether that's tough messages, whether that's inspirational information. We're sharing that from anything from small informal groups of people that we know right through to things like this. And where we've got potentially, what's the count? 346 people. Kind of wish I hadn't looked at that. But hundreds of people, or even the heady heights of a TED Talk. But what I'd suggest, whether you're here live now or whether you're watching this on the recording, just take a moment and think which one for you, where along that line for you, is it going to be most useful to think about today for the next kind of 50 minutes or so whilst we're talking about this. And bring a situation to mind. So if you have a presentation coming up, or perhaps if you've just done one, but have a real situation to mind, and hopefully that will help any of the sort of the more theoretical elements. You can start to kind of just plonk that information in to where is most relevant for you. So have a little moment. If you need to get a little pen and paper, make a little note or notes if you wish, then that is great as well. So in terms of how we can be engaging, in whatever format that is, whether it's small groups right through to TED Talks, the great thing for us is there's been a whole lot of research on it. And it really comes down to 3 key areas. The first is to be authentic, is to be ourselves. But in order to have that authentic presence, we have to have enough confidence to be ourselves. And for the quite a lot of you that are sort of in the 4 and below range, that potentially is quite problematic right now. But again, the good news is we're going to have a little dive into each of these areas, and there's a few things we can do that hopefully will make a really big difference really, really quickly. Then we're going to look at content. And honestly, this is the thing that makes all the difference with presentations. It really is the thing that's going to make a great presentation, or at the very least, a solidly engaging presentation. So we're going to touch on a couple of things we can do, just tweaks to what we're already doing that really can elevate and make those presentations way more engaging. And then finally, we're going to finish off on some interactive delivery. So what can we do, whether it's virtual or face-to-face, to whatever our own brilliantly authentic style is? How can we just add in a few little tips from psychology and behavioral science that will hopefully help, again, keep people engaged and keep people listening to what we are talking about? And hopefully I'll be practicing what I preach during this session as well. So what we're going to really be looking at is how can we build all 3 of those. If we get 1 out of 3, we're still doing relatively well. But if we get 3 out of 3, we're going to be absolutely like on top of everything. So the first thing we are going to look at is that engaging, authentic voice and presence. Because if we get that right, then everything else becomes so much easier. It can be a bit of a challenge though. Now, you may well, particularly given what you do for a living, you may have seen this before. So this is actually a bit of a mishmash of research from Hans Selye, whose name you might be able to see at the bottom right-hand side, who was really one of the very first people to look into stress. And also Yerkes Dodson, who came up with the Yerkes-Dodson rule in terms of how pressure actually interacts with performance. And what we can see is that we actually need pressure if we're going to perform well. If we don't have any pressure, then actually we're a bit bored, a bit lethargic. We don't tend to give our best. So we want a certain amount of pressure so that we get to what Hans Selye called eustress, which is basically shortened for euphoric stress. And think about a time where you've been doing something that really plays to your strengths and you've been really engaged and there is an amount of pressure there, but you're like nailing it. That's eustress, that's euphoric stress, and that is where we would like to be. So for those of you that were like 8s and 9s in that in the how much do you love presenting scale, then hopefully you're getting there on a pretty regular basis. What we definitely don't want though, and if you were sort of 4s and belows, this is might be your experience so far, and it certainly was my experience on that day, was what we now know as stress. But actually, it was originally called distress. And as you can see, there's some stuff we don't want there, but it tends to be pretty present. And distress, or stress as we now know it, I'm sure you're aware, is basically the new name for the flight or fight response. So it was the system that enabled us to fight or run for our lives back in the day. So if we were cave women and cavemen, and a wolf would come around the corner, before our frontal cortex would actually kind of notice it and analyze it and work out whether it was a problem or not, our amygdala, the lizard part of our brain, would clock it. It would send a message to our hypothalamus, and between them, our hypothalamus being kind of Boots the chemist, between them, they would flood our system with chemicals preparing us, such as adrenaline and cortisol, the stress hormone, preparing us to fight or run. So if ever you do get the shakes in a presentation, it's because you've got an overabundance of blood going to your main muscle groups, because your mind thinks you need to start running or fighting, neither of which you should do in a presentation, just to be very clear. So that's why you get the shakes. Why, if you ever have like if you go blank, it's because, again, the blood is going to different places. It's not going to the front part of your brain very much at all, because it doesn't need to be like, let's weigh up these situations. It's just helping you fight or run. So that's why sometimes you can go blank. We can actually, the latest piece of research you'll see there, we can have a lowered EQ, as in our emotional intelligence. And if ever you're really stressed, you know you're probably not the best person to be around. There's actually a latest piece of research which would suggest under stressful situations, we can lose up to 13 IQ points in a moment. So all of these things are happening. If you get butterflies in your stomach, it's because your digestive system shuts down, because we don't need the blood going there. We need it other places. So if ever you have that feeling, that's what that is. And which is, by the way, if you're wondering why, it's because you don't need to be digesting your last meal if it's your last meal, which is a bit macabre, but nonetheless, you get the picture. So all of these things that happen are actually happening because of that flight or fight response. But the key difference is the amygdala is not seeing a wolf come around the corner. It's now listening to our internal voice. It's being triggered by what is going on in our head. And often what is going on in our head is imposter syndrome. It is a little negative voice saying very negative things to us. And we actually refer to them as automatic negative thoughts, so our ants. Now, if anyone is there watching this thinking, Simon, I don't have a negative voice inside my head, it's that voice that's just said that to you. We all have that voice. The difference is, are we listening to it or not? So what we want to be looking at is how can we bring our natural strengths to the party? So what do we have that can help buoy us in that situation? But also let's listen to that voice and just start to question it, start to reframe what it's saying. So think now, what sort of things do you perhaps say to yourselves in that negative way in your head? What's it saying? You could almost think of it as a separate person. What is that separate negative person saying to you before a big presentation or even a small presentation? Often it's things like, you're not good enough to do this, or you're not senior enough. You haven't got enough qualifications. They're going to know more than you. What if you fail? What if you look stupid? What if you trip up? What if Zoom shuts down? All this stuff, and essentially it sets the amygdala off. So let's start talking back to that. And honestly, the easiest advice, imagine your friend was saying, your best friend in the world was saying to you, I've got this presentation tomorrow, and here's what I'm worried about, and actually said those things out loud. What would you say back? I can almost guarantee that you wouldn't go, oh yeah, you're right. You're not senior enough. Yeah, you probably will muck it up. Hopefully you wouldn't. You'd be really kind. So be kind to yourself as well. And there's some other things we can do that hopefully can help, some general things we can do. Firstly, confident uncertainty. Just remember, you live your life not really knowing what's going to happen, and yet you don't let that stop you. So an example of this would be when you last left your house. Did you, A, just confidently open your front door and walk through it? Or B, cower behind your front door and think there could be anything behind this door. There could be a tiger for all I know. I'm hoping it was A. Obviously, next time you leave your front door, you'll probably remember this bit and think, do you know what? Simon is right. There could be anything behind this door. So apologies for that. But no, of course, we live our life with confident uncertainty, and that does not leave us during a presentation. So as much as you can, relax into it, knowing that, yeah, things will go wrong. Almost guarantee it. I've done thousands of presentations. It's very rare to think of one that something, at least one small thing, hasn't gone a little bit wrong. So stuff will go wrong, and you'll deal with it. Will it always be the perfect way of dealing with it? Nope. Does it have to be perfect? Definitely not. People that come across as perfect in a presentation, we don't trust because they don't seem authentic. So be yourself. That is your delightfully brilliant, sometimes flawed self. And people will be engaged with that because it will be like their brilliant, sometimes flawed selves. Which brings us nicely onto the second one. You're equal to the situation or people. It doesn't matter who's in the audience. It doesn't matter how many PhDs they have. It doesn't matter how senior they are. They're just a person. Just a person. And I can guarantee that you have earned every seat at every table you've ever been invited at. You've earned your spot on any stage, on any Zoom webinar, on any situation. People aren't giving it out for a laugh. They're giving you that spot because you have something to add. And if it needs me to tell you that, then I'm happy to do so. You deserve to be there. And just because people are a bit more experienced or whatever, it means that you can help them even more in their lives or their careers. So remind yourself of that. And again, lean on your strengths. Endow the audience with belief rather than endowing them with boredom. We might see one person just check their phone and we'll think, oh no, everyone's hating what I'm saying. No, they're probably just, if they're me, they're probably just checking on their dog. Because I've got dog cam set up so I can sort of just make sure my dog's all right and not doing anything he shouldn't be doing, as subtly as I think I can. So yeah, endow them instead with curiosity, endow them with belief in you, endow them with passion. Neither is true. You have no idea what anyone is thinking unless they tell you. So why not endow them with positivity rather than negativity? And then finally, again, just that bring your positive self to the party. And what I really mean by this is, as I mentioned, there is no such thing as an engaging style. There is your engaging style, and that's the right one. So I've seen people that are really, really animated, and they've been fantastic speakers. One of my favorite speakers of all time sat in front of a big group of us and went through his research, his academic research. It's called Professor Michael West. Some of you may know him even because he did loads of work at the NHS. And he sat there and he went through about 300 slides, didn't move, wasn't animated, but it was one of the most engaging presentations I've ever seen in my life. So there is no such thing as one style that works. Find your style. Don't compare that to anyone else's. And if you are going to compare yourself to someone that's at the same kind of stage of you, stage as you even. See, I told you there was no such thing as perfection. Find someone that's the same kind of stage as you, but also remember, you're comparing your internal voice, which is often screaming during things that you're not a massive fan of, to their like swan-like appearance. But you don't know what's going on in their head either. And I'll let you know, I do, because I work with those people all the time. Sometimes it's like heads of business, CEO organizations, and they'll email me beforehand before we're doing a one-on-one session. And because I'll say to them, what did you want to focus on? And way more than 9 times out of 10, these super senior people that are presenting to thousands of people and shareholders and God knows what, they'll come back and say, Simon, I'm terrified. Please help. So honestly, take that pressure off. Again, we're equal to the situation or people. There's some other things we can do. By the way, before I move on, if you haven't already, have a little reflect on which perhaps for you can be most useful. Which might you just need to think about a bit more and remember when it counts. Oh, 2 extra little tips as well. I'd suggest be aware of your body language. So really know that if you haven't seen the Amy Cuddy TED Talk, I'd highly recommend it. Cuddy. She talks about power posing, but essentially, even if you're sitting there now, you can have a bit of a go at this. You don't have to stand up unless you want to. Just shuffle forward a little bit in your seat so your back's not actually on the chair, and put your feet flat on the ground. So balance your weight between your feet and just raise yourself up, put your shoulders back, put your chin up and smile. I know you're going to feel a bit stupid, but give it a go and just see how it makes you feel. And of course, if you're standing up, you could just do that same version, but just standing up. And that immediately starts to make a difference. And you can watch the TED Talk to find out why. But there is a really good reason as to why it makes a difference as well. And the other thing, remember to breathe. And I don't mean, like, obviously breathing is a good tactic for life, but diaphragmatic breathing, so proper deep breathing. The reason why that works so well and so quickly was back in the day when we were cave women and cavemen. Once we'd fought off that thing, or we'd managed to run away from that thing, which is largely an anaerobic activity, we take in huge lungfuls of air. And that's our body's cue, or our amygdala's cue, to go, oh, hang on, we're out of danger. Let's go back into homeostasis and get back to neutral. So that is why it works so well. And even if you're in the moment and you start to get nervous, take a few deep breaths, go into home position, as I would call it, and you'll find, hopefully, that will really help. Some extra things that you can think about when it comes to virtual presence, because there are a few extra considerations that are worth noting. Don't be a pea head. What we mean by this is don't be kind of a tiny head in your virtual space. Ideally, go for about sort of where I'm at, so like upper chest, so just a little bit above your head is perfect. So yeah, be aware of that. Good lighting. Key thing really is to make sure you don't have light behind you. That's when it's really, really tricky. So if you can get light in front of you, that's great. Professional looking background, of course, you can use a virtual background, but ideally, as long as it's not one that's really distracting, you haven't got loads of background noise and things, then you're all good. Little pro tip, if you can remember to, try and look at the camera as much as possible. It's really weird. Face to face, obviously, we look them in the eyes because that's the way to get engagement. But in virtuals, if we could see people's videos, if we were looking at them, it'd feel like we weren't. So it's a bit of a tricky one, but it's just a habit. Get used to looking at the camera and it will feel to everyone else, hopefully like it does now, that you're actually giving them eye contact. So if you've got a second screen, it makes it a little bit easier. You can have notes and things next, but like I'm actually just using one screen today. I have got a second screen, but I'm just using the one because I actually find it a bit easier for this kind of format because I can't see anyone's videos. But if there was loads of videos and the like, yeah, I'd use a second screen, but you don't need to. Close all other applications, particularly anything that's going to go bing or bong. Essentially try and shut down as much as possible because then you won't be distracted and you can give your full kind of effort in there. And then if you are going to do anything kind of fancy, like breakout rooms or polls or whatever it might be, then just have a bit of a practice. Make sure you can do it with no kind of issue or worry. And I personally would do this not only virtuals, but also face-to-face. Have a dry run. If you can get a mate to come along with you and join as a participant, even better. But literally this morning, I did a full run of this whole thing. Even though this is literally my job, I do it for a living and I'm very confident with what I'm doing. Still, stopwatch on, dry run, just to make sure I got it sorted. And if it's a slightly smaller event or smaller workshop, greet people in as they come. Let people in a little bit early, ask them to put their cameras on if they can to help you out, and it will get them engaged with you as a real person, and also hopefully it will just kind of calm you down a bit as well. So loads of different things. Pick the ones that you think are going to work best, or that you know you've used in the past and perhaps you got out of the habit of doing it, and make sure you apply it. So we've looked at engaging authentic voice and presence. We're now going to start looking at engaging content. And honestly, again, there's a couple of tips I can give you that might make all the difference. The first is just to really think about what is your purpose of your presentation or your speaking? What are you trying to do with it? And by that, I mean, are you trying to inform, to update? Are you trying to motivate, inspire, to influence, to change? But be really clear on that. Most people just open up PowerPoint. They've got their title of their presentation or the subject, and they just start overfilling PowerPoint with all sorts of bullet points and data and tables. Start with, why am I making this presentation? What purpose do I want to achieve with it? And actually, what do I want the audience to think, feel, or do differently as a result of coming to this presentation? And once you've got that really clear, it actually makes it quite easy to pick the right content and pick the stuff that's going to really resonate with your audience. And on that, the other extra little tip I'd say, think about your audience as much as you know them. And even if you don't know them, you could still make some educated guesses. What do they care about, both as a professional, but also just as a human? And what do they worry about? Because if your presentation can help them get to something they care about more quickly, or it can help them mitigate a worry or a concern, they will be engaged. And it really is that simple. You know, when sometimes people say, oh, what are all the advanced tactics we're presenting? Do the simple things really, really well and practice. That really is it. But if we want to really elevate our presentations and to be as engaging as possible, then facts and figures and data just don't cut it. So when I used to be a corporate negotiator, one of the first courses I went on, they were at pains to point out that when you've got undeniable logic, your only recourse is emotion, because emotion trumps logic every time, even with really logical people. And to perhaps prove that to you, think about something you've bought where you could have got a much cheaper version, but the one that you bought, when you saw it for the first time, you just went, oh, I really want that. And then you rationalize why you logically need to buy it. And by that, you tell yourselves rational lies as to why you need it, because you're probably going to be quizzed when you go home, or if you're anything like me. So emotion trumps logic. So we need to get people, if our purpose is to inspire, to motivate, to change, to influence, we need to get people in the fields. We need to get them in the heart. And the way in which we do that, one of the best, easiest ways to do that is to tell stories. So rather than me just talk to you about it, we are going to see one. And it is the brilliant Susan Cain, who's written a fantastic book called Quiet. And I have shared my computer sound. So fingers crossed, you will be able to hear this. So it's just a little excerpt of her TED Talk, about 3 minutes long. But as you're watching it, think about what's she doing that helps engage her audience? And indeed, potentially, what's she doing to help engage you as the watcher of the TED Talk? So enjoy this for the next couple of minutes.
When I was 9 years old, I went off to summer camp for the first time, and my mother packed me a suitcase full of books, which to me seemed like a perfectly natural thing to do, because in my family, reading was the primary group activity. And this might sound antisocial to you, but for us, it was really just a different way of being social. You had the animal warmth of your family sitting right next to you, but you were also free to go roaming around the adventure land inside your own mind. And I had this idea that camp was going to be just like this, but better. I had a vision of 10 girls sitting in a cabin, cozily reading books in their matching nightgowns. Camp was more like a keg party without any alcohol. And on the very first day, our counselor gathered us all together, and she taught us a cheer that she said we would be doing every day for the rest of the summer to instill camp spirit. And it went like this. R-O-W-D-I-E, that's the way we spell rowdy, rowdy, rowdy. Let's get rowdy. Yeah. So I couldn't figure out for the life of me why we were supposed to be so rowdy, or why we had to spell this word incorrectly. But I recited the cheer. I recited the cheer along with everybody else. I did my best. And I just waited for the time that I could go off and read my books. But the first time that I took my book out of my suitcase, the coolest girl in the bunk came up to me and she asked me, "Why are you being so mellow?" Mellow, of course, being the exact opposite of ROWDIE. And then the second time I tried it, the counselor came up to me with a concerned expression on her face, and she repeated the point about camp spirit and said we should all really work very hard to be outgoing. And so I put my books away, back in their suitcase, and I put them under my bed, and there they stayed for the rest of the summer. And I felt kind of guilty about this. I felt as if the books needed me somehow, and they were calling out to me, and I was forsaking them. But I did forsake them, and I didn't open that suitcase again until I was back home with my family at the end of the summer. Now, I tell you this story about summer camp. I could have told you 50 others just like it. All the times that I got the message that somehow my quiet and introverted style of being was not necessarily the right way to go, and that I should be trying to pass as more of an extrovert. And I always sensed deep down that this was wrong, and that introverts were pretty excellent just as they were. But for years, I denied this intuition. And so I became a Wall Street lawyer, of all things, instead of the writer that I had always longed to be, partly because I needed to prove to myself that I could be bold and assertive too. And I was always going off to crowded bars when I really would have preferred to just have a nice dinner with friends. And I made these self-negating choices so reflexively that I wasn't even aware that I was making them. Now, this is what many introverts do, and it's our loss for sure, but it is also our colleagues' loss and our community's loss, and at the risk of sounding grandiose, it is the world's loss, because when it comes to creativity and to leadership, we need introverts doing what they do best. When I was 9 years old,
Wasn't planning on playing that again.
I went off
Oh,
to
no,
summer
it's
camp
going to
for
play.
the first.
Do you remember I said there was always going to something goes wrong? There we go. So I'm hoping you enjoyed that. I'm hoping that you're thinking about those questions as well. What is she doing to engage? Now, you might be sitting there thinking, but as a TED Talk, Simon, like that's not my experience. I'm not that experienced. I don't have that same ability. I promise you, when it comes to telling stories, you do. Think about any time you meet up with your friends, or when you get home at night, if you're actually working out somewhere, and if you've got someone at home. First thing you do, tell each other stories. How did your day go? Oh, you're never going to guess. Or your friends, how was your week? Let me tell you about something that happened. We are all natural storytellers. We just forget that we can do it in an organizational setting. And we sometimes think we shouldn't do it in an organizational setting because there's all these academics. What are they going to think if I start telling stories? Actually, they're going to be engaged. That's what's going to happen. And the easiest example of this is think, if anyone watched Comic Relief recently, or any of those kind of charity appeals, the little videos they show you, they don't start off by saying there's 10 million people that need your help. They start off by talking about one person, and they get you engaged in that one person's story. And once they've got you, then they see, and you can help, because there's actually countless others that are like this. Get you in the feels, you're giving your money. By the way, I obviously know the science behind what they're doing here. I can't tell you how many £2 a month direct debits I have. I'm still an absolute sucker for those kind of adverts. So what makes a great story? Well, keep it simple, keep it short. It doesn't even have to be a story. Examples, anecdotes, case studies, but anything that resonates with the people you're talking about and has that hook that is actually relevant to what we're talking about. And if you can make it memorable, what did Susan Cain do there to make it memorable? There's a couple of things. Firstly, she had her bag. So she actually had a book bag to really sort of show us what she was like when she went to that camp. And then she gave that brilliant, but awful chant, the rowdy chant, and a little bit of humor in there as well. You absolutely don't need humor to make things memorable. But if one of your strengths is to be humorous, then definitely lean into that. So there was all sorts of little things she did there just to make it memorable. And again, we just need to think about, for instance, I talked earlier about my experience and gave you the little story of being on that stage and having my legs shaking crazily. And then just an extra little detail of my, like, and it was very, very true, sadly, but my shirt slapping against my skin, and even just giving my teacher, who I really liked, a name. And what's her real name? Mrs. Cleve, because we've probably all got Mrs. Cleves, which is also the final point, is keep it relevant. So make sure people can relate to the story we're saying. And honestly, that really is all there is to it. And you don't even need, please don't have to sort of go through, if you're thinking of a story that you might use in a presentation, you don't have to go through this list of things. It's certainly not an A, B, C, D, but it is just a useful thing in like making sure, just checking, like, yeah, it's definitely relevant. It hooks into what we're talking about. How can I make it memorable? And have a bit of fun with it. Honestly, it's been one of the things over the years that I've been doing this professionally, I've worked really, really hard at. And I think that's the key thing. We can often look at people and think, oh, they're just born presenters. I'm living proof that isn't the case. Often it's just a lot of hard work that's gone into it. Just like the stuff that you're brilliant at, the things that you are a 10 at in your world, I bet you just didn't start off like that. I bet you worked really, really hard to get really, really good. So yeah, just practice. The more you practice, try things out. Hopefully you'll surprise yourself at how much you can make a big difference in terms of how things are engaging. And another way we can do it, we can sort of see it a different way. Again, this is not a tick box affair, but just to sort of make sure we're covering the bases, share your why. So make sure that you are passionate yourself about the thing you're trying to get them passionate about or them interested in. And this is why it helps to think about what might they be worried about, what might they be engaged with, what might they look forward to. Why should they care about that? And try and position it for them. Share the journey, particularly if you're asking them to change something. Talk about what that journey is going to look like, and also what's not changing. Because often people are terrified of change, but if they realize there's only one thing out of a whole bunch of things, everything else is staying the same, just this one thing that's changing a bit, that might really help. And then, as we've just been talking about, bring it to life, but their life. So stories, examples, anecdotes, don't just rely on facts and figures, and you'll be in a really, really good place. So the last thing we're going to look at is what's that icing on the cake? So what can we do to keep things as engaging as possible? And this is where, again, we have a little bit of slightly less great news in the shape of a study that was done specifically on virtuals. So specifically on virtuals, and it showed how quickly people's attention came and went. It's not quite as bad for face-to-face, but nonetheless, it still does happen. So what we need to think about is, how can we make sure that we try and lessen either the frequency of those dips in attention, but certainly lessen the depth of the dip, so that we're keeping people engaged as much as possible. A really small thing we can do, that's really, really simple. If you are running a virtual session and it's not a webinar like this, and you've got a few people that have got their cameras on, and by the way, we talked about it earlier on, like welcome people in. That's the best way to get people to put their cameras on. I literally, the first person that I let in, I say, is there any chance you could do me a massive favor and put your camera on? Because if you do, when the next people join, they'll think, oh, we should put our cameras on. A tiny little thing. No one ever says no. But my hit rate for getting people's cameras on, even in cultures and the like where they don't tend to, is pretty good. But it's, again, trial and error over the years, particularly since 2020. But yeah, if you've got a few cameras on, just get rid of the slides for a second. Go into that grid view. It just feels a little bit more kind of connected. But yeah, essentially, contrast grabs attention. So if you were face-to-face, it might be you just get rid of the slides for a second. Again, it would just make people kind of focus in. Or if it was a smaller group and you were standing up, it might be sitting down. Or if you were sitting down, standing up. Even with your slides, think about, are they just really formulaic? Are they just the same slide again and again and again? If so, mix it up. Like go from a slide that has a fair bit of data to just a big old picture that represents something you're talking about, maybe the story that you might be giving. So there are definitely ways in which we can do that. And there's, again, a few that we're going to talk about specifically. So firstly, remember that you set the tone and the energy within a presentation you run. So even if no one's got their cameras on and you're feeling a little bit ill, then just give yourself a talking to, and try and up your energy. Like I have to do, this is my living. So, sometimes I really don't feel like doing this. I don't feel like being this guy, but if I want to try and be as engaging as possible and crucially get that message across and for people to remember it and do something with it, and hopefully that think, feel and do, then I've just got to try and find it from somewhere. And whether that's listening to my favorite song just before I start the presentation, or if I'm face to face just before I walk out onto that stage, or whatever it might be, or just looking at some photos that are going to make me smile, or just having a bit of a talk to myself. Do what you need to do and just up your energy. And again, it's your authentic energy. I'm very aware my natural level of energy is quite high. So it's just about whatever your authentic energy is, just turning the dial up a bit. And the bigger the group, the more you want to turn that dial up, but only as it pertains to your natural energy, which is important. Again, we come back to strengths. So and there's just 4 different examples here. It's not all of them. But what is your authentic dialed up voice and presence? And again, just lean into that a bit, and find strength from that. Even if it feels like other people might be like their energy's going, bring yours up, and hopefully that will bring people with you. And crucially, keep to time. I don't think in the history of presenting anyone's ever said that was great, I wish it went on longer. So if you can, try and make sure you always keep to time, and even finish a little bit early. And people sometimes worry about, but what if I finish too early? There's no such thing. People will love you for finishing a little bit early because they have a bit of time before their next meeting or their next virtual session or whatever it might be. Or you can just say, and I wanted to finish a bit early so we could really take a few minutes to contemplate what we've talked about today and just reflect. So you could stay in this room if you want to, or in the Zoom, whatever it might be, or you can go away and have a little walk and think. But I just wanted to give you that time back. I mean, it will very rarely happen because we normally are running out of time. But just in case you're worried about not putting enough in, that would be my top tip. Very rarely have to do it, but people love it when you do. So all of these things we can do. There's some extra things as well for virtual deliveries and interactions. I'm not going to bang through every single one of these. You'll have them all in the handout, or the slides rather, that you'll get. But all these things we can do. Again, you'll see storytelling makes an appearance there. Polls, gallery view, as we've just been talking about. You could use annotation if you're using Zoom and get people involved. Get more speakers, so it's a bit more conversational, which we're going to do in a second with the Q&A. Even adding a silent Zoom, so get people to reflect. This could give you a bit of thinking time as well if you need to. Have an emergency question that you could put in there, just get people to reflect, or use perhaps kind of get yourself sorted. And particularly with visuals, less is more. So even if it means like graying out some of the aspects and let people know that the one they're going to get has all the information they need, but less is more, which is why I didn't start off with that slide looking like it does now. It's what's known as cognitive overload. It's just too much. So, if it is going to be a busy slide, use builds as we just did, and it makes it a bit easier to see. And then an important thing to bear in mind is have a plan. So timings is always going to take more time than you think, particularly in virtuals. So go through things, have a plan B, and don't be afraid to use it if you need to. Whoever your tech person is, have them on speed dial. That'd be my top tip for that. Have multiple backups. So, just in case your video didn't work or you got kicked out, know the number that you can call. So at least you can have your voice in the room. But ideally, that won't happen, of course. But if you know what to do if it does, we won't panic too much. Your amygdala hopefully won't get involved if it does. Yeah, have a bit of a just in case list, as I mentioned, a question that you could ask for people to get involved with or reflect on whilst you kind of sort things out. And again, we come back to it. We love strengths at Capfinity. Always use your strengths. So if something does go a little bit awry, lean into it. And if you're a planner, you can hopefully plan around it. If humor is one of your strengths, you can just have a bit of a joke about it. But the key thing is, don't let your internal voice become your external voice, because when things go wrong, you're going to be kind of screaming in your head. So just kind of swallow that down. Think swan-like. Remember, 15-year-old me found out, as long as you don't tell anyone, no one knows that you're panicking or screaming in your head. So that is absolutely key. And then the final thing before we move to the Q&A, rather appropriately, is questions. So even if you didn't know an answer, there are things we can do. And again, they're all on the sheet there. The great thing is some of the people that you're going to be speaking to, of course, are going to be like brilliant experts in their field. So if you know who those people are, as long as you know they know the answer to a question that perhaps you don't, you can go, do you know, actually, there's someone even better placed than me to answer this question. If you don't mind like joining in, whether it's a virtual or not, that could be a great way, because then it gives them the stage and they might really enjoy it, as long as they would enjoy that and they're not like hate you for it. So maybe double check if people are happy to help join in if you wanted them to. But also, I think the most important one, if you don't know, just say you don't know. The way I would say it is, that is a great question. Do you know, I'm not completely certain about that. So what I want to do is double check. And if I can get back to you afterwards, if that's okay. Who has more credibility, that person or the person that is quite clearly blagging? I think we all know the answer to that. So be really, really careful about telling yourself you have to know everything. You don't. You are an expert in what you're talking about, but that doesn't mean you know everything. Again, perfection doesn't exist. Progress, not perfection. And yeah, as you can see, you could have a story, you could throw things out to the audience. We are really strong proponents of thinking about what questions might come up. And actually, if you've got a friend or a colleague that can help you, like watch your presentation and ask some really challenging questions, have a bit of a practice, that can be really useful. Of course, yeah, you can throw it back to the audience or to someone else. You could even ask that person, what's your experience of that so far, before you give your experience. There's so many different ways in which you can do it. But the key thing is, again, keep any screaming in your head, keep it in. You will be fine. You deserve your place to be there. Tell that ant and that negative voice in your head just to do one for a few minutes, because you know what you're talking about. And worst case scenario, you make someone else feel good by saying, that is such a good question. Do you know, I'm not entirely sure. I need to check. And everyone's a winner at that point. They think you're really trustworthy and they feel really good because they've asked a great question. So yeah, it's all to play for. So conscious of time. We've talked about a lot in this session so far. So my suggestion would be, have a think about, what will you commit to doing, whether you're live here right now or whether you're watching on YouTube. What's resonated for you? Was it thinking about being your authentic self and thinking about perhaps some of those little techniques we can use to help us be more confident? Was it thinking about just starting the presentation, or rather before we start writing the presentation, thinking about some of those questions, thinking about how we can use stories with the content? Or was it, of course, just thinking, right, yeah, I'm doing a lot of interactive stuff, particularly virtually. I need to up my game and try a few different things. By the way, really important note, that slide that had all those things, don't do them all in one presentation. That would be overwhelming. Just pick 2 or 3 of them, and that would still be more than enough to keep people engaged. So I really, really hope you found that useful. What you have got is this slide that's going to have all this extra information. So whether you want to read some stuff or watch some stuff, we'd highly recommend all of that in there. But for now, we're going to throw back to Lucy, who's going to host the Q&A for us. And hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions. Though I am very aware, though, of course, I've given away all my tips now. So if I say, that's a great question, I'll have to check on that and get back to you. You know that I actually don't know the answer. So fingers crossed that doesn't happen. But thank you so much. And I'll look forward to hopefully answering some questions now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Simon, for delivering such a powerful and informative session. So I'll open up to the Q&A now. There's still time for those of you joining us today to send in your questions by clicking on the Q&A button, and you can send us the questions to us anonymously and upvote on the existing ones you want answering first by clicking on the thumbs up icon. So the most upvoted question that we currently have is, let me just grab them up. So first question, Simon, is how do you continue to be upbeat when you don't have a captive audience, or they perhaps don't laugh at the humour? It really is demoralising, is what somebody's popped in the chat there.
Yes, I feel your pain. The humour thing. So there's a particular session that I run, and it's like a big conference session thing, where I kind of think of them as like entertainment. I've got like 1 hour and I'm being brought in specifically to kind of, up normally it's that 2 o'clock slot. So up the tempo a little bit. And there's one story that I tell, it kills every time. Literally, it's this little anecdote, and it, cut a very long story short, and it was a wrongful arrest. I got arrested. I got then de-arrested when they realized what they'd done. But it's a very, very funny story. I got to the punchline, there was about 500 people, not a single laugh. And it really caught me off guard. I was like, oh no. But then as I'd like to think, humor is one of my strengths. You can obviously be the judges. So I then thought, because it does sometimes happen, I went, oh wow, tough crowd. That's the funniest thing I've got in my locker for today. Expecting a laugh at that, because normally you at least get a pity laugh. Nothing. Really challenging. So my top tip would be, particularly if humor is one of your strengths and you like to use it, it sounds awful, but almost plan for it to not work. So I think it'd be great if people laughed, but they're not necessarily going to. So that when that happens, when it appears to be a vacuum of energy, you're kind of like, oh yeah, I was expecting that. And essentially laugh at your own joke. And I know normally I wouldn't suggest that in social situations, but if you're in a bit of a kind of like this, if you're in a bit of a one-way situation, and people haven't got the cameras on, they're not interacting much, then just imagine you had a bunch of people behind your web camera that were all just laughing at you. I actually have some of my colleagues, so professional speakers like myself, they have photos of their like family and their friends and stuff like that, like laughing and smiling behind their webcam. And that's who they imagine they're talking to in those situations, because it is tough. And I have it myself, particularly with virtuals. Like people sometimes don't put their cameras on, and yeah, it is really, really tough. But yeah, for me, I just try and imagine, even though they might not have the cameras on, in my head, I imagine them laughing. If it's face to face and they're not laughing, I just think that's a thinker. They're going to get it later and they're going to be guffawing to themselves. But yeah, try not to let it kind of bum you out and affect your energy too much, and just think, I'm gonna be my authentic self, and know that sometimes you just can't be all things to all people, but trust that enough people, even if they're not laughing with you or interacting with you, enough people will respect that you're being yourself. So that would be my top tip on that. I hope that helps.
Amazing, Simon. Thank you so much. I'm sure that will have resonated with a lot of people. So thank you. We'll go on to the next most upvoted question. So it's, what if my mind goes blank when I stand up or in the middle of a presentation? Any tips? I think we've covered on this a little bit, but any more detail on that area for people?
Yes. So yeah, that is the good old fashioned stress response kicking in. Our blood's not going to our brain properly. And then, yeah, it's like, what was I going to say? So top tip, if you are face to face, then I'm just trying to find some notes here. There we are. So I have my notes. This isn't this session. It's a completely different session, but I have my notes printed out. Sorry, I don't know if there we are. I'll put it against myself. So I have 6 to a page and a few notes like written there. Wherever your notes are is where your water is. And if let's say you're on a stage and you're well away from, because I wouldn't suggest stand behind the lectern if you can. Try and be like, it's more engaging if you're kind of away from it, unless you have to. Then if you're one side of the stage, and this has happened to me countless times, and this is what I do for a living, so countless times I've gone blank. You just, again, don't let it out, because you're still probably talking about the last thing as your mind's gone forward and gone, what comes next? I've got no idea. Just calmly, as you're still talking, walk over to your water, grab your bottle of, I would suggest a bottle, by the way, normally, because then you don't have to worry about spilling it. Grab your bottle of water, have a sip. Even if you were right in the middle of a sentence, no one really thinks anything of it. You weren't thirsty, but what you did do, as you picked up your bottle, you just glanced down at your notes. Okay, that's where I am. And then, of course, when you put your bottle down, you can have another little glance if you need to. It's the ultimate get out. And again, with virtuals, if you have got a second screen, great, because you can have your notes like as close to your webcam as possible, so you can have a little look at them if you need to. But of course, you still could have them printed out and just have a quick sort of shifty glance down if you need to as well. But yeah, it doesn't matter how many times I run a presentation or a training session or a webinar, I always have notes. I spend my life talking about this subject. I still would never do it without notes, because you just don't know when your mind's going to go blank. So yeah, water where your notes are, or of course have it on, if it's a virtual, have it there. Never be afraid just to have a little glance. And of course you could, if you really needed to, have that emergency question. Say, do you know what? Have a little think about, we've covered quite a bit already in this however many minutes. So have a little chat with the person next to you, or if it's a virtual, have a little think for a couple of minutes. I'm just going to we'll do a silent Zoom. Have a little think about what's really resonated so far. Turn your camera off, let them do that, and then find out where you are. Have a couple of deep breaths, get in home position, force yourself to smile, and kind of get back on track. And if it was face to face, yeah, have a little chat with the person next to you. They'll be doing that. They won't be looking at you. You can find your notes, find out where you are. So yeah, that's honestly, it happens more frequently than I would like, but people don't think it does to me, but it does.
Perfect. Thank you, Simon. And on the back of, I guess, having just looking through the Q&A, so one of the next upvoted questions is actually, I feel I need a script for presentations. So obviously there's a fine balance there in terms of having that preparation in place, having those notes, but how do you become kind of in a position where you familiarise yourself with notes, but you're not in a position where you feel like you need a script for a presentation? Have you got any advice on that?
Yeah, I'm so pleased that question came up, actually, because it is, I've seen so many people basically lose themselves into a script. It's newsreaders are being paid quite a lot of money because they are amongst the tiny proportion of people that can actually sound animated whilst reading. So the rest of us, including myself, it turns out, can't. I once made myself a teleprompt. I was so impressed with myself. I literally made myself a teleprompt during lockdown because I was running something a bit like this, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to script it. And thankfully, I recorded it beforehand, and it was terrible, really, really bad. So trust in your knowledge. You wouldn't have been asked to present on something unless you had a relatively decent amount of knowledge anyway. So trust in that. Think about what is your key message. What's the most important thing people leave with? And again, if you think about what do they care about, what do they worry about, answering that. And again, notes. And so for me, like what's on, again, I'll just kind of put this against myself so you can sort of see it. I just have little sentences, short little sentences that are just enough, along with the pictures or, you know, the bits that I can see on the slides, are just enough for me to go, oh yeah, that's what I was talking about there. And essentially each one is like the key message from that slide or the key point. So if I need to, I can glance down at it. And then I'm my authentic self. So it will never be the same each time, but it will be me and it will be a real person speaking rather than someone. And we all know when someone's kind of reading from a script. And a flawed, authentic person that isn't reading and is adding value is way better than a supposedly perfect person that is reading a script. So it takes a while to feel used to doing sort of, you know, having scripts. Just start gently. Just try and get away from it a little bit and sort of see how it goes. Maybe just for a section. Just think, right, I'm just going to sort of prove to myself I can do it, and then build it from there. And it took me a while because I did used to have kind of a bit of a scripty thing when I first started training. But when I actually finally made the switch, it was so freeing, and I could finally be myself. And I just thought, as long as I'm adding value, no one knows what I was actually going to say. So if I don't quite say what I thought I was going to, it's fine. It really doesn't matter. As long as they've taken away that key message, you're all good. So I hope that helps.
Perfect. Thank you, Simon. So I think we've got time just for one more question before we wrap up. So I'll give you the final question, Simon, which is, how do you know how much content to cover in a presentation, and how do you decide what to leave out? Sometimes you only have a very, short slot of maybe 5 to 10 minutes, something like that.
Yes. Basically, put less in than you think is my absolute suggestion. So, because you never know if there is a question or anything like that, it could really sort of put you back. And then there's nothing worse than rushing at the end of a presentation. So really think, right, what could you give stuff out beforehand for people to pre-read, or is there stuff you can give out afterwards as like extra reading if people are interested? And again, come back to that key message. What are you really trying to get across? What's the most important thing that people are going to leave with, or that you want them to leave with? And then genuinely, I think, what's the least amount of information that will allow me to accomplish that key message? So I really do try and think less is more. There's a brilliant quote from Mark Twain that said, "I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one." And I think that's brilliant. And I think it really pertains to presenting as well. So yeah, I think as little as possible. And then you can always send stuff either before or afterwards that has more of the content.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Simon. I hope everybody has found this webinar beneficial and feels able to implement some of the behaviours and some of the techniques that Simon has talked us through today. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, for those of you joining us live, as we close the session, you'll be asked to complete a quick evaluation form for us. The link is also available in the chat box. This will give you an opportunity to share your email address so that you can receive a copy of the slides. And if you have the time, please do provide us with your feedback. It is greatly appreciated. All of our past webinars can be found on the NIHR TV YouTube channel under the Development and Support Webinars playlist, and you'll find a link to this in the chat box as well. You'll also find links in the chat box for our online leadership e-learning modules on NIHR Learn, and these are available to anyone to utilise, and our NIHR Academy events page, so you can be kept up to date with up and coming events as well. So thanks everybody for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.